So, good afternoon. We're approaching the end of the semester, and this is one of the last talks of the semester. We're saving one of the best for later. Our speaker today is Kirsten Bay, and she has a really interesting background. For those of you who think that you have to have a background in computer science or computer engineering to do security, we have a counterexample that isn't the case. We have someone who did a degree in English and in German, and then took that and just an analytical and curious nature on to get involved in security issues in Washington. Worked for a while for SRI, for EyeSight. Ben was involved in providing advice to congressional committees looking at security regulations, provided information to a White House commission on energy security. Went on to serve as an executive of several security companies, and is now one of the better-known CEOs of a smaller startup that's growing quickly in the security space. And without further ado, I should also mention, in her bio you saw she can correct you in either English or German, but I think one of the things that's most interesting, she really knows her way around whiskeys. So, with that as an introduction, let me turn this over to Kirsten Bay.
Thank you very much, Beth. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for joining me today. One of the things I really would like to encourage you to do is ask questions or comment. There are several things that I think are worthy of discussion in this particular discussion as we go forward. So today, I really want to talk about how we better integrate and collaborate with industry, government, and individuals. I'm finding, and Spaff and I were talking about this earlier, that there's this odd dubiousness that people have right now about cybersecurity and sort of believing what it is that we do and that we actually know who the bad guys are, or that we know what the bad thing was that perpetrated an event in a network or against someone. So I think it's worthy to really think about how we delve into really identifying the so what, right? I think this is something that for me, as I work and manage a cybersecurity company, that we really grapple with. And I'll get a little bit more into what I mean by that. But I really want to understand and get your perspectives also on how we solve for a very challenging problem that I think, as we look at technology and integrating technology into now the business as well as just being part of an IT stack, which I think many people still think about when they think about us in this land of cybersecurity, that we think about the journey and our current state of where we are today and what's driving some of the dialogue that we have, and how do we change? How do we bring people on our journey with us and help them understand our level of expertise, and that's something that is worthy of exploring in a way that can be more informed. And then some use cases that I think are interesting and fun that really, I think, bring in that integration and help us understand how we can be better at talking about what we do, but also really being part of the business process. So I'll warn you ahead of time, there are gross generalizations and statements I'm going to make, but there are some exceptions to those generalizations. But it's difficult in a short period of time to get incredibly specific. But so pardon me if I make some generalizations that people, well, that's not entirely true. It's mostly true. So I'm going to start a little bit with my journey because it's relevant to how I got here and the perspective that I have tried to bring over the years. Now it's been over a decade that I've been in information security, and the perspective that I brought. And as Spaff has said, the interesting thing is that I came into this world as a bright-eyed person who had some ideas about econometrics of data risk and zero knowledge of technology. And so I've grown into that now in my role, but certainly this is where I began. So you'll see that I was a little blonde girl at one point and incredibly precocious. And so my desire was to be a CEO even when I was little, and people thought I was weird. And I'm still weird, and I'm very proud of that. But the thing and the reason why I put that there is I was always inquisitive, always wondering, and some people refer to me as a serial entrepreneur. I refer to myself as a serial student, primarily because I love to learn, but also because, as you can see, my journey has been fairly circuitous. And so I would rather not be considered crazy and rather be considered just really inquisitive. So I continued my journey on, went to the University of Oregon, and majored in English and German literature with a substudy in German philology. So I can read Gutenberg's Bible, and that was pretty much all that you could read in Altdeutsch. But what it really informed me, and actually Spath helped me with this a long time ago, is I said, I wasn't really ever good at math. And he said, but you majored in a foreign language and you understand so much about this foreign language. How is it possible that you think you aren't good at math? Well, I was good at math and I struggled in math. And he said, no, people who can do what you've done actually have a really analytical mind. So thank you for that. It actually buoyed me in a lot of ways. But it really helped me understand that there are so many ways to think about problems. And so I was having a conversation yesterday with someone and they said, well, why didn't you major in business? I said, because I can learn how to run Excel. I can learn how to do business math. What I wanted to do was learn how to think very critically. So that's what I did. And then, as you can see with these dresses, ended up in an executive training program in finance, in fashion of all things. But learned a lot about finance and business. And then moved into supply chains and garment manufacturing. And what was fascinating about these 2 points is what you really learn about business is that it's learning how to measure risk to make the best possible decisions for the best possible outcome for your business. I won't even say profit because that's just one of the elements. It's really advancing a vision for something that you do and managing the risk within that vision. And so I became very intrigued by risk management, especially as I got into the components of supply chains, because you have all these incremental variations that inform you and also blindside you in ways that you could never imagine, like Guatemalan guerrillas stealing 28,000 yards of fabric from a truck. I can assure you they did not want that really ugly fabric. They just wanted the truck. But those are issues that you grapple with. And then I went into finance, worked in finance and high net worth management, and was really interested in how we value intangibles like art collections, restricted stock, and other elements to really inform how you invest and understand your risk in investments. And then one day was working with someone who was working with the former CIO of the White House on writing a book on built-in security. And this was during the economic crisis. And said, can you help us with looking at valuation models for loss in data for cybersecurity? And I was like, I don't know anything about security. I have no idea what you're talking about. No, it'll be fine. So I started working with these people who were working on the X.806 standard, and they were experts from Bell Labs. And I got intrigued by this world. And as I started to look at this and looking at all the structural issues that we had in our economy, I started to really think about, how does security apply to this? Can security apply to this? And so I started thinking about all of the business work I had done and all the risk management work I had done and all the valuation studies, and realized that there is so much about a built-in security model and cybersecurity in general that informs us on how to be really good at risk. And in fact, this is our future. We know this now today, right? And so I started thinking about, well, we can insure it and we can transfer risk and we can have better business process and we can kind of use security to be sneaky and start to get businesses better at business. So I went to Washington and I pitched this idea. And as Spath said, I started doing all this work and policy work. So then I did my life in compliance and worked with NIST and DHS and NSA, represented centers of academic excellence, and really became immersed in this world. And the thing I will say is I, for the first time, felt like I was home with this group of people. People who wanted to solve a problem, people who saw the bigness of the problem, but people who saw that this is the future, our future with this world, and we have to get really good at risk and risk management, and that this is part of the future of how we're going to be better at managing our businesses and our governments and our individual lives. And then I went in with my little spy land where I worked at iSight, really learned how to try and help enterprise customers as well as government consume intelligence products. They struggle a lot to this day. Worked in big data analytics with running a company that did NLP processing for social media. And that's really when I learned how to do technology, like databasing. How do you manage a Hadoop cluster with Vertica instances, and why do they keep crashing, and all of those pieces that really started to help me bring together the components of understanding our security world and the technology that's required to power it. And here we are now at CyberAdapt. And very quickly, just for context of this conversation, as I bring together all of these different components, and I think the interdisciplinary elements, which is why I'm taking the time to talk about this, are so essential for us to be really good at what we do in this profession. And with CyberAdapt, what we do is we do network traffic analysis in network, in any laptop, tablet, or phone, and we treat it like network traffic. We can inspect every packet and alert on anomalies. And so it's interesting as I deal with customers because the element is dealing with context and dealing with the so what. And so this is part of what has really started to help me think about how we tackle some of these questions, because I really started to look at this digital revolution that we're in. And it already kind of feels a little bit passé to say this, but the fact is that we can extol all the virtues we want to this element of what we do and how we think about these challenges in our environment. And in fact, many new businesses are cropping up all over the place because I think one of the things the digital revolution has done for us is remove the middleman from so many different elements of businesses. So now people can get on a platform, the internet, and do business directly with people, reduce costs, be more efficient, order shampoo, get it the next day. It's great. But in our reality, we now are the vector. So as I look at, we have one of the largest repositories of Android malware. The things that the adversary is trying to do to figure out how to leverage the mobile platform, the social media platform, the way to get to all of us as individuals, each one of us is a vector that has 1 billion points. Our personal lives equal our company lives. And it's all in the cloud, right? So we're really creating this soup that allows for a different level of complexity than people have ever really been associated with in this world of security. So it's no wonder, right, that every day we wake up and we see something new. And everything's, I just saw at the Consumer Electronics Show last year that even your shirts, you can have these wearables now that measure all of your biometrics and put them in the cloud, right? So it's everything. But there's so much at risk. And what's interesting about this is that as we look at the Target breach as an example, the Target breach was a small business that ended up creating a big business problem. And so we need to pay attention to both sides of this equation. But the reality is that 60% of small businesses will go out of business, lose everything if they get it wrong. So we have a tremendous amount at stake. And now we look at this, right? We have Facebook, and people go, well, Facebook wasn't really hacked. That's not part of this conversation. But as I look at sort of the three-legged stool of what creates challenges and vulnerabilities in our environment, certainly the social engineering element of it is very relevant to our world and has been part of the world that we've known for a long time, right? It's the first step to compromise. We have Equifax, and as Beth and I were talking about earlier, the people not being really able to understand, it's not just your social security number or your birth date, it's the fact that they have now a level of detail about our lives that we don't even fully understand about ourselves. The predictive analytics that these machines run in terms of our knowing when are we going to buy a house or even have another child, finance and education, those things are actually modeled already in many of these institutions that now are leaking out in the world. Big data applies on both sides of the equation. And of course, we have the NSA. So we have this drumbeat that's accelerating in terms of how we're at risk and how we're vulnerable. And so for us in this room, it's kind of, well, yeah, of course, we know this. Yet, even though we know it, there are other people out in this world who struggle to understand the importance and to believe what we are saying is true. So not to get too political with you, but here we have, well, maybe we have the data, maybe we don't. And most Americans at this time, and I actually picked older ones because it was interesting to see as this was starting to kind of rise in its awareness of what had happened. Most people didn't believe it. And I actually knew people, and I was saying, no, this is true. Why? Because I've spent time in this other side of the world. I understand the fingerprints, and I understand the modus operandi. But you haven't actually seen it happen. You haven't actually seen the data, so you don't actually know. How do you argue with that? right? I mean, and these are the challenges where, is it that they don't want to believe? Is it that you just can't believe it if you haven't seen the data? Well, that's tough in many situations with cyber events. It's very difficult to prove in many regards, even though there are moments we can get to full attribution down to the actual perpetrator. But how do we get people to join us in that conversation? So what? So what? Because that outcome of the election doesn't matter. I'm happy with it, or it doesn't matter because it was messed up anyway, or it's all stupid. These are all answers that we hear. And yet, what I think is important for us to really get down to is there's actually an important so what, maybe even if you don't care about the particular outcome. But how do we run businesses? How do we run governments? How do we understand that our privacy is protected? If these things are happening right in front of us and we go, well, that's not a big deal. And that's something that I'm confused about, because when I go back over and deal with customers, I get a very similar answer. You have command and control ransomware speaking to something outside your firewall. And how do we know this? We know this because it's not the data that's leaving your network, it's actually the answer back that we caught. That's what we're actually picking up on. Nothing else has seen this, so we're telling you, you must do something about this. Well, I'm not really sure it's that big of a deal. Well, we think ransomware is a big deal, so we think that you should do something about it. And then, we sit with this customer, and 12 weeks later, in fact now, 18 machines inside this environment are now all talking to this command and control. And they're still saying, we just don't think it's that important.
Isn't there some legal requirements to be aware of that, and burying their head in the sand is going to someday catch up with them very badly in court?
Well, I think so. I mean, in this regard, though, they technically have not been breached. And so that's really the interesting portion of this discussion. As we interface and as I interface with customers, both on the intelligence side and on the side of delivering a software product that's intended to fill the gap of needing to contextualize that intelligence, that technically they're more indicators of vulnerability. They're not indicators of breach, which is what I actually want to give you, right? I want to give you an indicator of vulnerability because you can actually solve for it before a bad thing happens. Now, to your point, if you don't do anything and an event happens and then you have a post-breach event, you have the foreseeability issue, right? Someone was telling you for 12 weeks. What we also find, though, with many security practitioners who either are overburdened, understaffed, or just don't have the level of knowledge that they need, they just don't know what to do. And they'd rather we didn't tell them. And in fact, we get them in situations where they're like, we don't want to talk to you. We just can't deal with it. We're sorry. And it's a really difficult conversation to have, right? I mean, it's a difficult thing to say in an open environment where who knows how many people will watch this, but I think it's important to say because we have to find a way to not put our heads in the sand. And I think that to the other point that you asked is when you ask that person to go to senior management and try to explain to a CEO or a CFO, this is our problem, and so we need to invest in a security product, or we need to change policy, or we need to have people not going to sites, or we need to block these sites people like. It creates this hornet's nest, right? It creates the people and procedure and technology, like all of these elements that become very thorny for people, that becomes easier to go, it's probably just not that big of a deal. It hasn't gone bad yet.
So going back to a lot is about risk management. It sounds like your approach is mostly with the technical side, the information security side, and not talking about risk management to senior leaders, where they would understand a terminology and say, listen, we realize that there's some things that are out there, but the consequences are not worth the cost to prevent them from happening because they're going to happen so rarely, and the consequence is so little that the cost of preventing exceeds it by far. But I think the case can be made more and more with the news that the consequences just keep getting worse and worse. I mean, there's nothing like automation to make it really bad. And so Do you offer to go to senior management with them to help plead the case? Okay.
Well, in fact, absolutely. And I think what you're saying is exactly right. And so I was saying that my most excited favorite accomplishment at this moment is that we finally have been embedded into a cyber insurance product. And we're continuing to move into that realm. And it has always been my desire to really engage both the risk side of the business as well as the side of the business that's in the senior leadership side. Because of the level of awareness now that people are developing, it's become much easier to have that conversation. But the other thing that makes it easier to have that conversation is that for a long time, I think in cybersecurity, we weren't able to talk about risk transfer in a way that people were really that interested in it, because when I would talk to certain institutions, they would say, when we think about credit card fraud for us, in the unacceptable loss category, is actually just someone writing someone's card number down and charging on it, right? It's not a hacker stealing card numbers or even ranges of hashes or any of those things. That still is lower in comparison to just the outright fraud issue that we have. So we're going to tackle that problem in a different way. So now, because when you've seen that Target, I went through their entire cyber insurance policy in, I think, less than a month. And so, they've now had many losses. And that was really the first example of senior executives losing jobs. Now we've gotten to a point where they've become so massive, and it's not just about an email or something that's considered not that interesting of data. Now the conversation of risk transference is becoming something that people are really willing to talk about, because now they're realizing, I don't know what that number could possibly be. And so I think that this is really a watershed moment for our industry in general, which is our ability now to engage senior leadership and say, I'm never going to say malware to you once in this conversation. Don't even want to mention it. What we really need to talk about is, how do I give you the requisite data and understanding of where best to make your investments, where best to transfer your risk by buying policies, and where best you can accept it. And that's I think, where we're making progress.
I don't mean to monopolize the questions.
Great.
So have you broken down the risks from like loss of records to, in, let's say, manufacturing, or let's say a financial operation, disruption of production, and then the loss that occurs when intellectual property is lost? Have you bracketed those risks and consequences yet?
There are a number of companies who have, and the Ponemon Institute actually is one of them. We use Ponemon Institute data for that. We have a partner we use in our company who actually goes and they put an agent out that essentially pings devices and databases to see what's credit card, what's a net address, and what's potentially intellectual property. When you get to intellectual property, it's a lot more challenging in that regard, but when you can get at least the standard brackets around what we generally know, how much does a credit card go for in the underground versus a date of birth, or whatever the information might be, you can at least get a good baseline to say that those are the potential risk elements. The other thing that we have is we chart out in the risk piece kind of in these brackets of $100,000 increments of, if you have these types of events in your, like ransomware as an example, this would be a high criticality event and high risk event in dollars lost, reputation, so that you can start to grade it across a multitude of categories that give you an overall risk score.
I'm not sure if we're thinking the same Ponemon reports, and I've seen those, and they break it down by industry, by country, and they kind of focus mostly like on record breaches. The question I've asked is a leading question. It comes from a company that came in here, their CISO came out, and he said, and I won't tell you who it is because it wouldn't be appropriate, but he said, the record breach is one thing. That's been quantified by Ponemon, okay? The loss of production is problematic, especially if you have a large amount of value built in to say, let's say, high precision, whatever, okay? But they really fear the loss of intellectual property, because that means that's typically not something that criminals do. It's typically things that states or competitors do, and it could cause basically the collapse of the business.
Well, there are a number of examples of what you say. There is the example of the steel industry, where actually the Chinese were in a number of different manufacturing environments so that they understood the trading numbers. So they actually understood the high-low, and then they would underbid, and then they actually collapsed the aluminum market, the steel market, both by buying up companies, flooding the market, but also gauging and understanding how to be more competitive, right? So that's a good example of that. We have a copy of the SR-71 in the country as well. So that definitely is, and it's very difficult. Those are the hard things to quantify. Actually, in one of my use cases that I was going to talk about is the Maersk event, because the thing that I don't think people realize is that they have to reset not just their data center, because the people are, oh, that was just like a data center thing. Well, it's a huge, gigantic company, but it literally was their entire infrastructure, down to RFID sensors that are, charged with actually pinging out data for manifests. So the loss that they have experienced, I don't even think we've quantified yet in terms of how massive it was. And to your point, I mean, part of it is like with FedEx. I mean, that's another great example of one where they had a ransomware attack. They were part of the, I think, WannaCry. I'm starting to lose track of which is which anymore. But the European division actually was down for, I think, 45 days. And FedEx didn't have cyber insurance. And so this is kind of where I'm thinking about in this particular, how do we get people to think differently about this? Because they said, well, we're not an internet company. And so I think about, well, how many times do I have a FedEx guy come to my house? A lot. And every time I sign my name, doesn't that thingy ping up to the internet or someplace, right? And that's the thing that I found remarkable, is that as sophisticated as a supply chain company as they are, they didn't really perceive that to be the critical component or vulnerability of their environment. And so those are the things that I think were really just coming online. So now I was in an elevator, and I saw the little news thing in the elevator, and there are now companies, several of them, Maersk, I don't think FedEx was one, but there were a couple of others, who posted third quarter losses because of the cyber event. So this is the first time we're ever even seeing this, right? And the balanced challenge to this is that for insurance products, the insurance products are actually being commoditized in price. The prices are going down because, in fact, they don't know quite how to price them. So they're actually trying to get entry into the market at a low price, but the problem is that they're sort of like this, well, we hope that they don't get breached. So we're seeing companies that are asking to be underwritten who are smaller businesses who can't even be underwritten because they don't even have the requisite number of controls in place to be able to have insurance. So it's a really dynamically changing market. And as we look at the commonality between these breaches, that is becoming, of course, the thing that we all know. Number one, we have a human error, bad hygiene, lack of risk awareness. I mean, the basic, the usual things. But why? Because criminals evolve, right? I mean, this isn't a new phenomena in our world, right? This is how, it's probably the second oldest profession, right? And so it's how do we understand the evolution where they don't have boundaries, but we do, right? When we're trying to create agencies and law enforcement and rules and regulations to just understand how do we enforce things, that becomes a big challenge. And so we were talking earlier about just even the bank robbery example. Because I think part of it is the personal connection to a breach versus if I were in a bank and the bank would be robbed, I'm not going to blame the bank if some bad guy comes in and sticks up the bank. It's not the bank's fault. Bad luck, right? But if it happens to me when I am at home and it's my account, I'm very angry with the bank. And that's not a wrong thing, right? I should be. But it's this transcendence between our ability to get good at protecting physical space and not being as clear on how we protect this other virtual world we live in, and getting people to understand its relevance to them as well. Which means, it's that personal impact. And part of it is trying to figure out how we integrate that personal connection to these things. And I think something that, interestingly, the Equifax breach has, I think, accelerated that conversation. And as we talk to partners, the thing that we're finding that people are really getting much more concerned about is the privacy element. And so it's like, well, you can call it anything you want. If you want to start paying attention to it, I'll change it. We'll call it privacy. But because it has a much more expansive view to it. It is If my attorney has my estate plan and all of my records and my CPA has my financial records, I don't want people to have that data. And I'm going to be furious if my CPA or my attorney gets hacked, right? So when we've started to kind of change this into a privacy conversation, I find that we're getting a lot more traction than, hey, you should deploy this product and your network should be secure. And then it becomes the same old so what conversation, and does it really mean anything to me, and the usual. But this is the other thing we know. The likelihood that someone's in there or about to get in is extremely high. But so what, right? And that's the thing that I am fascinated by, is the ability for us to now really make it the connection point between this is your enterprise industrial environment and your personal environment, and they really are intertwined, right? If I have to answer email at home on my iPhone, how is that any different? And I think that it's incumbent upon us to start to define ways and to bring people into the conversation, because going back to the conversation about just around the election, it was, well, why don't you want to believe this? And why is it that, and why is it that it's a so what to you? And so I think that these are the things where we have to start thinking about, well, we kind of started this conversation in the middle, right? In this conversation around the election. And when we're starting the conversation where we are starting here, I have this huge body of knowledge around all of the ways that the Russians have been trying to get at us, and the Chinese, and bad guys here, and the Romanians. So I have a huge amount of context available to me to kind of quickly go, yeah, I mean, something happened, but they don't. And so I think that's one thing is how do we go, when you go to a cocktail party and there's a doctor and someone complains about their elbow hurting, someone can make a recommendation. When I go to a cocktail party and I go, I work in cyber, and people go, hey, did you know that there are like whole armies of hackers? And they do, and I'm like, yes, I did actually. I knew that. So it's an interesting dynamic that we have. I think is so young that's part of it.
Isn't there, I can't quote the studies, but there's something when folks are overwhelmed with a problem, they just slip into denial because they don't feel they can do anything. And so sometimes it's showing them what they can do about it that suddenly makes them, and of course telling about friends who've really suffered as a consequence of not doing the things that you're suggesting is a good idea. But that's a very human factor. People just lock up when they are overwhelmed.
Yes. Thank you for that segue. Which is exactly that. It is, they do care, but it is so massive. And when you talk about the complexity, the size of the internet, and what is actually the internet anyway, I mean, these are things that are very complex and difficult for us, even for those of us who do this every day. When we start sitting and mapping a network, it's like, oh my, I don't even know where to start. So I think a big component of it is this context piece. It is, well, what does this mean? Okay, Equifax was hacked. What does that mean? Well, we can talk through all the elements of that and talk about the fact that that's a big data issue and so on and so forth, right? But then what does that mean to me? Like, how does that impact me? And so you can say, well, it's broader than just a social security number, right? These are the potential ramifications. But on the balance, you also have, well, but the NSA has been collecting all this data about me for all this time, right? So does that really matter? And so what do I do about it? Can I really do anything about the fact that my information is potentially out there? And so I think it's trying to lend context to the fact that you can empower an individual, or you can empower a company through individuals to be able to be better. Because the challenge is if I'm getting 50 phishing emails a week, or whatever it happens to be, how do I even know? How sophisticated are they? It's like, as you say, I just don't want to think about it. I don't know how to think about it. So I think part of it is making it digestible. And it's kind of the not interesting part of our conversation, which is the compliance pieces, the basic blocking and tackling, the policies and procedures, but they're all useful elements of helping people and understanding how people are being targeted. And that's one thing that we've been really focused on is, how do I understand how, because I can look at how people are activity on all these devices as well as in network. So I can start to see the difference between how are people being targeted when are they being targeted through LinkedIn? Or is it still just email? Are they being targeted through apps? So how is the adversary trying to change their behavior? And then how is that different to how they're trying to attack a network? Because what we see generally is that activity is coming down a little bit, and that we're seeing these attacks moving through endpoint devices. So it is now, how do we help people be more secure? And I think part of the answer is, as we even look at the younger generation, it's the old seatbelt analogy or the airbag analogy, which is you wouldn't send a car out without an airbag, right? Not anymore. It's not 1971 anymore, right? I think the younger generation just thinks, well, why on earth isn't it secure? Why isn't my phone secure? Shouldn't it just be secure? So I think that there will be a market component that eventually will help us catch up in some of those realms, that then will also, I think, give more of the contextual understanding around that. So this is an eye chart, you don't have to read it. But this is one of the discussions around the Maersk situation. And the bottom line is, because this is the more important piece of it, what could have been done to prevent it? So I'll just read it for you because it's small. Risks must be assessed and safeguards put in place prior to such severe vulnerabilities are found by the bad guys. So they had machines that were unpatched. That was the bottom line, right? And so, yet they control the vast majority of the shipping traffic. And so you had entire ports that were shut down. So when you go back to the question you asked, which is, well, now you have entire companies and the question becomes, well, is it business interruption insurance? Is it cyber insurance? Is it you're just too bad? I mean, so those are the things that I think will start to drive more of those measurements, because it's much more challenging to say, well, it doesn't matter because you had some random unpatched machine. And so, there are lots of technologies in place that auto patch and do all these things. But the fact is that this comes into this defense in depth conversation, right? How do we get defense in depth to ensure that we have the basic blocking and tackling? And then how do we have senior management understand, however you don't need to go into the nuts and bolts of it, that these are important elements of your overall strategy? Because what's fascinating and why I like the supply chain examples is having worked in supply chains, we understand things like weather risk, geopolitical risk, all these elements, risk of just human capital, all the components that go into integrated supply chains. We understand pretty well how to segment those out, measure them, and secure them for what we understand to make for business plans. And yet now this piece is really becoming a part that we don't understand very well, but needs to be integrated. And so I think it's a great place to start as we talk about these use cases, because you see the broad range impact. So the other thing that's happening, and this is an interesting use case because it was a very simple badging situation, right? Which is people just got in and they changed manifests, and it's like anything right now. You can do cyber attacks instead of going in physically attacking people, and you can have the same outcome. But my other favorite one is that there was this group of Mafia guys who decided that they could hack the manifests in these RFID boxes on the containers and say there are bananas and apples and other perishables in these containers, so we're going to prioritize them. And so this guy comes to go pick up this container, and in fact they just get mixed up, and this unsuspecting truck driver picks up the container with guns and drugs in it when he thought it was perishable, and starts to drive away, and these people start shooting at him. And he's like, why are these guys shooting at me? And of course, the whole world descends upon this port. They start ripping things apart, and they have found that these RFID manifests have been hacked. And so it's a really fascinating business use case because they shut down the port for over a week. So you have lots of perishables sitting in this port, but now you have the ATF, the FBI, Interpol, like every law enforcement agency you could imagine. And you have people who now can't get their goods out. And you also have just the pure interruption of a port that generates millions, if not billions of dollars a day. Everything stops. And so where the insurance companies got very interested in this is of course it's them, right? So it became, well, that's business interruption insurance. And they're like, well, no, that's not us. Well, it's cyber insurance because they hacked it. No, that's not us either. That doesn't apply to, well, it's just basic business insurance because you lost your products. And it's like, well, maybe, but I'm just a container person. I just had my goods in a container and all of this other stuff happened. So now, as we come back to how do we marry this conversation between cyber and technology and the business, it becomes a much more broad conversation. It becomes something that people really start to think about. And they're all also like movie scripts that you could write. So it becomes much more interesting of a use case than, well, there's this unpatched machine and this thing happens. So I find them very interesting discussions that I think are enabling us to find ways to introduce risk management into these conversations where people think it's a pretty mundane topic. But when you apply these types of use cases where cargo thieves have fake badges and they're hacking RFID boxes and they're sneaking in and they're stealing cargo when it used to be this really complex physical security problem, now the cost is going up. But as I love this, the incidents were actually dropping, but the cost of those breaches were actually going up. And so these are the things that I think then go back to that threshold conversation. Acceptable loss is no longer part of it. Now we really have to figure out how we're going to manage that in the same way that we understand you don't put boats in the water to take goods across at this time of year because the likelihood that something will happen and we lose cargo is real. We don't engage with pirates. We don't go that way anymore. We go a different way. And so it's this broader conversation that I think is important. And it's this cross-disciplinary approach where we have to be able to engage a larger context. And to the question you asked about senior management, so it's a very near and dear subject to my heart because it's really the business value piece for me that I've been trying to bring to this industry. To get people to answer the so what because we actually are able to understand why it matters to these different stakeholders in a business. So I held these dinner sessions and I invited people like general counsel and chief risk officers and CISOs and different people to have what I called an active listening session where I would call it marriage counseling between senior executives and CISOs. How do I get you guys in a room and actually have a conversation where you have the same vocabulary? And so this risk officer from a very big insurance company was saying, well, it's very simple. You see, what you do is I just call the chair of the audit committee before a board meeting and I tell him, okay, so these are the things I can't put into the agenda, but we really need to talk about from a risk perspective. So can you please ask me these sets of questions so that we can actually get this dialogue going on the board level because they're really important to our business. See, you should just do that. And the CISO, a very large bank, said, are you crazy? I can't do that. Have you lost your mind? I can't call the chair of the audit committee. I mean, seriously. And the CRO sat there for a second and he goes, yeah, you're right. You really can't, can you? He's like, no, I'm not at that level. And so that was when we really had this change in conversation where it was like, all right, how then do you, Mr. CISO, engage with me as the CRO so that you can push that dialogue up to me, that we forge these relationships and have this type of dialogue so that I can represent them at the board because as board meetings go, the poor security guys always go last. Board meetings always run late, so there are 30 slides turned into 2 slides and they have 4 minutes, right? So how do you condense that conversation but already have it out there and on the table? And so those are the things that I've tried to, from my industry knowledge and experience, to try and get people in the room and just have that conversation. And my hope is that people went back to their offices and we published some of this. And we're also trying to publish just PowerPoints. Here's your little guidebook to going to a boardroom and don't say malware, right? No one knows what that means. But to really help support the security professional to engage in that business conversation. And while the technology components are so important, it's also really important to speak the language of the people who are receiving that message. And so if there are any other questions, I thank you very, very much for listening to my story.
Questions? No? All right. thank you very much for coming and doing the presentation for us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your great questions.